Hey guys, Brenden, by the way, that audio guy. A lot of people construct really great mixes and then they get to the mastering stage and potentially destroy them because of a limiter. And that is because of something called dynamic range, and they don't understand exactly how that works. So they learn about a limiter, they learn that if you use a limiter and control the threshold, then you can get your song to sound loud like your favorite song that you heard on the radio, but they don't know the math behind it and what it's causing to their music. And this is a huge problem nowadays, and it's something that we're in called the loudness war. You may have heard of it, and it is basically everyone is trying to get their track louder than the next guy because naturally by your ear, if something is louder, you think it's brighter, punchier, fatter, bigger, wider, whatever you want to call it, but in reality it's not. It's the opposite. So what is dynamic range? In a simple form, it is your average level compared to your peak level. It is that difference. So here you have your average level and here you have your peak level. So the larger that scale, the larger this difference is between your average level and your peak, the bigger the dynamic range. So the smaller you get, the smaller the dynamic range. So if you've ever seen waveforms that are like sausages and they're just flatlined, that's because they don't have much dynamic range. Whereas if something has a lot of lines, then it has more dynamic range. So let me show you what I mean by that. Right here, we've got a waveform from a Genesis song that was the original mix, and then this was the 2007 remaster mix. So you can see that it's a lot more flatlined. There isn't as much dynamics like this one. And your quieter part is now as loud, in a sense, as your big part. So let's pretend that this is the pre-chorus and it's a little bit lower, as we can see on the original mix, and then it goes into this louder chorus section. But on the remaster, it kind of looks like it's the same level. And that's the biggest problem when you lose the dynamics, is that there isn't much of a difference between your quieter, softer parts and your huge, big ending chorus. A lot of people think if I can push this so loud, then people will feel that awesome ending chorus. But that doesn't quite make sense because you are turning up that quiet part as loud as your ending chorus and not resulting in any difference. So let me show you what that looks like using photography. So this is a website talking about high dynamic range in photography, and basically that means it takes a couple of different images and combines them together to get the best looking image. So if you look right here, we have your original image on the right, and then your high dynamic range, or HDR image, on the left. So in this HDR image, you can see the clouds, there's texture in them, they get darker, this fence gets a little bit darker, and it kind of leads your eye out to the ocean, which leads you to the sky. And you can see that it's stormy, it's moody, whereas this one looks like any regular person went out to the beach and took some picture. You can't even really tell that it's cloudy, you can just see that it's overcast. The water doesn't have much texture, it doesn't tell me much of a story, whereas this one does. Here's another great example. Right here we have a tree, and we can see that that is the main focus, but behind it are some clouds that give us this nice texture. You can see that we're in an open country. It looks like a nice day. There's a horizon. You can see this house over here, and you get a sense of depth. You feel like when you look past that tree, you are seeing far out into the land. Whereas the original photo, the non-HDR photo, you can't even tell that there's a second cloud here. You can barely see this one here, and it looks flat. It just looks like there is some shrubbery hanging around a tree, and it's just a flat image. There's no depth, there's no perception of a horizon, you don't even really notice the house. But in this HDR image, everything comes together to complement this main tree, which is the center focus. And this last picture is awesome because right here it looks like almost an accidental picture. There's no focus, this wall gets in the way, you don't even really notice the door, but in the HDR version, you kind of have this vignette going on, and it accents everything about this door. Your eye goes directly to that door. It really shows off and tells a story. It says, okay, this is a moody spot, and I'm telling you something about that door. This door plays a key role in the next picture or the next frame or the next scene. The thing I'm trying to get across with these pictures is that it's this contrast. It's these shadows and this darkness that bring you into focus on an image and have all of these elements complement it. Whereas this flat line, yes, you can see everything clearly. I can clearly see this corner of the brick that I can't see in here, but it's because of this contrast that I really love the door, and it makes me look at that door and focus on it. Another picture I love is from Sound on Sound in their article about dynamic range. They were comparing music from 1967 and 2007 and saying how dramatic the dynamic range has changed over the years. So they used this picture to represent the music in 1967 and then this one to represent in 2007. So you may look at the two and say, well, I like this one because I can see all the details. I can see, this city behind it, and there's no real shadows, and it just creates a clearer, brighter picture. Everything has presence, but look at this picture for 20 minutes and then go back and look at this one. The difference that your brain and your eyes would feel is like drinking a cold glass of water. It's the contrast in this picture that makes it beautiful. The true blacks, the shadows, the thing that brings your focus to right here rather than what are you even supposed to focus on in this thing. Yeah, you can see everything, but there's no clear definition of anything. Everything is trying to compete for your attention. So let's take what we saw with those pictures and relate it back to your song. So here we have a graph. You probably recognize it from my How a Compressor Really Works video. If you haven't watched that, I highly suggest you check that out right now so all of this will make sense. So let's pretend that this is your song. This is your mix represented in this graph, and you are ready to get it mastered. So you can see that you have high peaks here, some average levels around here, and then here are your lower levels. So like the pictures, this is like the tree or the door. These are your accents. These are what is calling my attention in your song. But these things down here are more like the clouds or the sky. They are there, they are helping out the overall picture, but they're not the thing calling out my attention. That is dynamic range. It's the contrast between the two. Now, what happens when you bring in a limiter? So a limiter is basically a compressor with a really high ratio, and because it has such a high ratio, it's going to say anything that goes above my threshold, I am virtually going to cut off. But it also has an additional element, which is the ceiling, and that is saying, even though I'm limiting all these things at this ratio, I will not at all let anything above this marker, which is my ceiling. That is like getting scissors and chopping off your audio, or getting a wall and having things hit that wall. So let's grab your song and throw on the limiter. So you can see that it has now chopped off these levels because they are going above the level that we have set for your ceiling. Now, like a compressor, what happens when we bring in the threshold? So let's pretend that this yellow line is our threshold on our limiter. So the more you bring this down, the more it is bringing up those average levels and lowering our peak levels. So let's pretend that this light blue color is our new levels of these bars right here. So now that we've lowered this, we have brought these levels that were right here up to this ceiling. So if you remember back to our first picture of your original mix, we used to have peaks going all the way up to here. But now that we've brought in our limiter and lowered our threshold, we are bringing up these average levels, these background items like the clouds or the brick or the flat fence or whatever it may be. We are bringing that up, which is distracting from our tree, our door. So the more you raise your average levels and lower your peak levels, the less contrast you are creating. Let's lower our threshold again. So now we've lost even more information. All of this information is getting slammed against this limiter and being cut off. So if we were to lower our threshold even more, it would look like this in a sense. Obviously, you would never do this with a song, but this is basically what you are doing. So now you may be wondering, okay, how do I prevent this and what does this actually sound like? Well, the prevention is easy. That is saying, I don't care how loud everyone else makes their music, I am going to set my music at a certain level. I love what Ian Shepherd said. He does his at a -10 LUFS ballpark. It just makes your songs feel right while still being competitively loud. So you can do that by getting any type of meter. I like to use Isotope Insight, and I just go off of the integrated LUFS. And when that says around -10, then I know I'm on the right spot. I don't care how loud so-and-so's track is. It doesn't matter to me, because if I know that my track is at the right level, then that's awesome to me. Sometimes I will go a little bit louder if the song calls for it, but that is in a rare case. And sometimes I'll go quieter if it needs it. I think the biggest problem with all of this is people use limiting to get a song loud rather than trying to make their song sound better. Because yeah, using a limiter helps your song glue together, just like a compressor helps your song glue together. But if you do that too much, then you are destroying the contrast. You're taking out the punch of your song. So be smart. Do what is best for the song. Who cares about the actual loudness? Everyone has a volume knob. Everything has a volume knob. So if it's too quiet, they can just turn it up. So here's a song that I did, and I want you to listen. I'm going to black out the screen. I just want you to focus on listening. So I'm going to play one version that is more compressed and more limited, and one version that is the release that I did and at the level that I chose to release it at. So I'm going to volume match these so you are not deceived by the louder version.
Came up without making a sound. You never saw me coming out, shaking the ground. I got 'em all lined up, now I'm knocking 'em down. Giving up to dominoes, giving up to dominoes. Came up without making a sound. You never saw me coming out, shaking the ground. I got 'em all lined up, now I'm knocking 'em down. Giving up to dominoes, giving up to dominoes.
So could you hear a difference? If you couldn't, it's okay. You may not know what you're listening for. So what you should be listening for is how when the kicks hit, how everything interacts with each other. Does stuff duck? Which mix felt bigger? Which one felt more open? Which one had more clarity and more contrast and dynamics? Which one had more punch? Which one felt like you could see the whole picture and the other one was a little bit more pressing on your ears and right in your face? Now, I'm not saying if you like the compressed over limited version that you are wrong. In my opinion, I feel like more open, more dynamic songs sound better. They are more pleasing and they are easier to listen to for longer periods of time. If you go and listen to a classic album, like anywhere from 60s to 80s, it may be a lot easier on your ears than something, say, from 2010, because in 2010 a lot of stuff was really hard limited, and so if you listen to a 40-50 minute album, at the end of that your ears may be a little bit fatigued, whereas an older album it wouldn't necessarily feel that way. So let me show you what the difference was between the two. On the original I did mine at -10 LUFS, whereas the higher limited, more compressed version I did it at around -6.6. So let me show you the difference without the volume matching.
Came up without making a sound. You never saw me coming out, shaking the ground. I got 'em all lined up, now I'm knocking 'em down. Giving up to dominoes, giving up to dominoes. I came up without making a sound. You never saw me coming out, shaking the ground. I got 'em all lined up, now I'm knocking 'em down. Giving up to dominoes, giving up to dominoes. I came
Now let's listen back to those volume matched.
up without making a sound. You never saw me coming out, shaking the ground. I got 'em all lined up, now I'm knocking 'em down. Giving up to dominoes, giving up to dominoes. Came up without making a sound. You never saw me coming out, shaking the ground. I got 'em all lined up, now I'm knocking 'em down. Giving up to dominoes, giving up to dominoes.
So on the non-volume match ones, you probably thought that the louder one sounded better. In a sense, it does, because you are tricking your ears. It's that thing I talked about at the beginning. Something that is louder naturally sounds better. But when they're volume matched, then it doesn't sound quite as good, at least in my opinion. Now, you may be saying, well, why does this even matter? When is stuff level matched? Well, on iTunes, if they have sound checked, or on Spotify, natural by default Spotify sound checks things. On radio, like iTunes Radio, Spotify Radio, Pandora, they will say, okay, here is where your music can be played at this volume. So they will bring down every track to that level. And if your song is more dynamic, then it will come across louder. Why? Because you have more room in between your average level and your peak level. And so when they say, well, every song at their average level has to be turned down to -16 dB, then your song at its average level will have to be turned down to that, but you still have these huge amounts of peaks, and you still have that much more room to be punching through on the radio. whereas someone with a really squashed track will be turned down to that same negative 16 dB, but they only have this much of a difference to play with. Your song will end up sounding louder and punchier, fatter, bigger, clearer, all those positive things that we want your song to sound like. So trying to make your song louder than your neighbor or the song on the radio just for the sake of making it louder, I don't think is a good idea. If you are trying to get that sound, then yeah, go for it. But if it is for the purpose of just trying to get your song louder, it makes no sense to me. Again, take this for what you will. This is something that I've developed opinion over the last couple of years. My first album I mastered a little bit louder, and I listened back and I really regret it. And so when I remastered some of those tracks, I made them a lot more dynamic, and to my ears it sounds a lot better. It's easier to listen to the whole thing. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and sign up for my email list where I will give you exclusive content and things that I only send to the people on that list. And also head over to the website itsthatAudioguide.com, and I will see you guys soon.